Appreciate everybody's attendance, and we are going to try to finish up lesson 2. If you remember, on Sunday we've been talking about the idea of peacemaking responses. So we talked about the kind of responses that we can have that are pretty negative, that don't really promote peace. We talked about attack responses, the way that we might, what we might call peace-breaking responses. And we talked about peace-faking or escape responses. And now we're talking about, and again, going back to the idea of the slippery slope there. We're here in the middle of this, and what would put us kind of on top of the slope, on the less steep, hopefully less dangerous part of the slope where we want to be. And so we began on the left side of that, of looking at things like overlooking and reconciliation. We talked a lot about that on Sunday. Can anybody just briefly tell me something they remember about overlooking or reconciliation, something that made you think? What about overlooking? When do we want to overlook something? Kind of maybe what's the difference in denial and overlooking? Does anybody remember kind of how we talked about that? I think, we talked about that fine line between denial and overlooking, which is, denial is when we're pretending like there is no problem, and overlooking is when there really isn't that much of a problem. It's something that we can just kind of forgive and forget. I kind of think of it as mind over matter. If you don't mind, it probably doesn't matter. So we can kind of think of it that way. And then we talked about reconciliation and this idea, and of course reconciliation is always part of our goal when we have some kind of a conflict. We want to get to a point where whatever has caused division between us and someone else, that we can put that aside and be reconciled, be brought back together. And so that is something that we have to pursue. Kind of back to that denial thing. If we deny that there's a problem, then we're never going to have reconciliation, because we're not going to have any way to put that problem aside. It's going to remain a stumbling block in our relationship. And so just as, what caused separation between us and God? Sin, right? And so Christ brought about an avenue of reconciliation, right? Because it didn't matter what we did, it didn't matter how many sacrifices and good deeds we did, could we repay, could we overcome our sin? Could we overcome death? The penalty for sin? No, we couldn't. But Christ could, and Christ brought about that for us and made a way for reconciliation. And so when we think about our earthly relationships, how do we get to that point? Well, we've got to find common ground. We've got to find some way to absolve whatever this issue is. And so depending on the situation, that may be asking for forgiveness. That may be, repaying some debt that we may have incurred and failed to, and I don't just mean that in a financial sense, but perhaps someone has done something for us and we've failed to appreciate that in some way, or just offered our sincere apologies for some wrong that we've committed in someone's life, and made reconciliation for that. So that's what we're trying to get to.
John, if I was, you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, if I was having to pick which one on that board was the best one, my understanding is reconciliation is probably the top one. It would be best if I have some issue with my brother, if I could go to him or he go to me, however that works, and we work it out. And I think it's kind of interesting that's in between overlook and negotiation, which is I'm going to have to defer in some way to them. Either I'm just have to overlook this thing, or we're going to have to enter into a negotiation where I give up, something, and they have to give up something. But either way, my understanding is that's probably, if you can go that route, that's probably the best one to go down.
Absolutely, and I would say that of all of these, well, really, no matter where you start on that slope, reconciliation is where you want to end up. It's where you want to get to. And it's not in the center just because of reasons, but I think it is kind of ultimately the goal. But I think it's a part of that paradigm because it is something that we have to do. It is something we have to go through. It's not just an end result. It's a process, and it is a response. It is something that we have to take part in, and it's something that we have to seek out. But when we talk about reconciliation and overlooking, we talk about a lot of these responses. A lot of times we're talking about things that are maybe emotional, things that are maybe intangible in a lot of ways, hurt feelings, things that it's not that someone took something from us necessarily, but maybe in our heart and our attitude, they took some joy away from us from whatever happened. We're talking about kind of emotional things. But are all conflicts inherently just an emotional thing? Are there other things that can come up? Well, absolutely. I think there are material things that can get in the way of our relationships. There are material things that we can have conflict over. And when there are material issues in our relationships, whether it be a business relationship, whether it be a family relationship, those of you who bought the book, it starts out, one of the first kind of scenarios it gives is a family who's struggling over an inheritance, over property. And I would say all of us know of some family that has, an inheritance has caused horrible problems in their family. Because now all of a sudden it's, he said, she said, and I want, and this, that, and the other. And so we can oftentimes struggle with these material things. And when that happens, before we can get to, a reconciliation, we've got to come up with a plan. We've got to come up with an agreement that makes sense for everybody. And a lot of times that's going to involve negotiation. In order to resolve material issues in good faith, we've got to figure out a way to satisfy all the parties involved. And so, like I said, if you have the book, that family in that situation, they needed to set aside some selfishness, a lot of them, in order to get to that point. But then they also still had to sit down and come up with a plan that was equitable, that was fair, that took care of everyone involved, and in the ways that they needed to be taken care of. There was one member of that family who it was a more emotional attachment, and so he needed to be cared for as well. And negotiate. What is negotiation? How would you define negotiation?
Discussion or something to come to an agreement between two parties or even more parties, but
yeah,
I negotiate prices
right
every day.
Right.
Not often enough, but
Tim, you know, when Tim sells a tractor, do you want to sell it for the lowest price possible?
Try not.
Not exactly. That cuts into your commission. That cuts into, you know, your company's bottom line and things like that. Does the customer want to get the lowest price possible?
Absolutely.
Right? So now you gotta, you know, there's your conflict, right? You want to get what you can get, and they want to get it for as little as they can get. And so you've got to come to an agreement. And, you know, when I was reading about this, I thought of Bill Ray. And I know there's a big wall mural in your warehouse over there with a lot of Bill Ray isms. And one of them, I believe, is if it's not a good deal for both sides, then it's not a good deal. Is that correct?
You're in the neighborhood.
Okay. And so, you know, that was one of his philosophies. If the agreement that we come to is not good for both of us, then it's not a good deal for any of us. And I think there's a lot of biblical wisdom in that, and there's a lot of truth in this idea that, you know, just because I can strong arm somebody into agreeing to something, it doesn't mean that it's a good deal. It might, in the short run, be a good deal for me. But it's not going to help our relationship, and they're not going to want to, whether do business with us. They're not certainly not going to want to be friends with us once they kind of figure out what kind of a person that we are, and they're certainly not going to want to talk about the gospel with us because if we're not exhibiting the love of Christ in our daily life. And so this idea of negotiation is about sitting down, and it involves a lot of listening and understanding, what do you need, what do I need, and how can we find common ground here to move forward. And so when we run into difficulties in our lives, sometimes that's the hardest thing, is for us to just stop, sit down, have a cup of coffee, and say, how can we work this out? What do we have to set aside in order for that to happen?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the first and hardest thing, is we want to set our needs, our desires, the things that I want, ahead of what they want. And that's certainly not the way that we should act. And the Bible speaks to that in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4. It says, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also the interests of others. And so certainly, you know, we can look at that in a lot of different contexts here. We can look at that in the context of the church and how we look out for one another, how we care for one another. But I certainly don't think that that's limited to these walls and these relationships. You know, if we want to demonstrate that to the folks that we encounter in the world, you know, that certainly has to be our attitude. You know, we can't be loving and caring, you know, on Sundays, and then through the rest of the week be trying to slit everybody's throat to get ahead, and pretend like somehow that's okay. And so we've got to set aside our pride. We've got to set aside our ego, and be willing to sit down and understand what the needs are of others, and to look out for those things the same way that we look out for our own interests. Any thoughts about any of that? Again, not easy. You know, it's kind of easy to make a little bullet point and say, oh yeah, negotiation, you just sit down and talk about it, everything will be fine. It's a little more complicated than that, but it is something that we can get better at, and especially as we begin to look at things through this biblical lens of peacemaking. Again, the reason we call this personal peacemaking, what do you notice is kind of in common between all three of these things? We don't really need a third party, right? In order to overlook something, do I need a committee to tell me to overlook a small issue? I hope not. I hope not. Hopefully, I don't need a committee or a group of people to help me reconcile with somebody. And oftentimes, if our first instinct is to run and tell 14 people, guess what so-and-so did to me, we're going to make it a lot harder to get to reconciliation, because we're working really hard at telling our side of the story and not trying to negotiate, not trying to reconcile, not trying to listen. And the best kinds of negotiation are one-on-one, just me and you. We don't need to worry about what everybody else thinks. Let's just me and you sit down and let's figure this out. I'll be upfront and honest with you. You be upfront and honest with me, and we can work this out. That's personal peacemaking. Is it always that simple? No.
Would it be okay to seek advice, not necessarily go and tell your side is and give a negative to the other side, but seek advice?
Glad you asked. That would be what we call assisted peacemaking. So that's what the second half of this is about. And again, if we look at our chart here, the other side of the top here, these are all mediation, arbitration, accountability. These are all things that are going to involve someone else, where we've come to the point of hey, we can't sit down and negotiate this. We're not there yet. We need help. Whatever the problem is, we need help. And it may be that we haven't communicated well. It may be that there's something that we're unwilling to let go of. But whatever it is, we're at an impasse and we need help. And so, again, the first thing I would say about all of these is, where are we going to go to for this assistance?
Wise people.
Right. Yeah. One of the things, those passages we read about, why are you taking the brethren to law? Why are you allowing the world to settle your disagreements instead of godly people? If we're going to people in the world, oftentimes it may be because we're hoping that their selfishness can be our selfishness, rather than seeking wise counsel from godly people. We need to be seeking the kind of counsel, the kind of wisdom that's going to help us not only solve this problem. There's lots of ways to solve problems that aren't necessarily the best ways. We want to solve them in a way that honors God, and that's going to be kind of the next thing that we talk about a lot is how we honor God through all these processes. But if we're not going to someone who we see is someone who honors God, who fears God, who seeks to do His will in their daily lives, then why would we go to them for help with a problem like this? So that's the first thing that we need to think about is where are we going to find the kind of godly wisdom that we need to help with this. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind, I think for a lot of us, is going to be the elders. Obviously, when we appoint men as elders, we do so based on their character and the things that we know about them, things that we know about their lives, their wisdom, their knowledge, their ability to teach, and their ability to discern what is good and what is true to God's Word. And certainly if we have entrusted them with something as sacred and important to us as the church, then I would imagine that some of these more trivial matters in our lives, and even things that aren't necessarily trivial, but are certainly more trivial than the unity of the body of Christ, are things that they can help with. But it may not be, there may be someone else who is perhaps knowledgeable about whatever it is that we're having an issue with, someone who has been through something similar, someone who has a lot of wisdom and experience in whether it be negotiation or something of that nature. But again, making sure that they have doing the right thing, doing the godly thing in the forefront of their mind. And the first idea there is mediation. And I think, the reason mediation and negotiation are right there next to each other is fairly obvious. What is a mediation?
Negotiation involving third party.
Yeah, it's an assisted negotiation. So, if we try to negotiate and we can't get there, and this is certainly a big part of our legal system, particularly with civil disputes. When there are civil disputes, a lot of times courts will even say, hey, you've got to go to mediation. You've got to find a third party here to sit down with you guys, whether it be companies or people, neighbors, whatever, and try to figure this out. Because obviously, just the two of you can't do it. You keep butting heads, but a cool head third party can oftentimes resolve these things. And certainly that can be the case in the church as well. So when an agreement can't be reached privately, we need to seek wise counsel from a godly, objective third party. So if me and Trevor have a problem, we're going to go sit down with my dad, right? He's an elder. He's wise. He's really smart, funny, likes me. He likes Trevor too.
Objective.
And, objective. That's a problem, isn't it? Now, Dad's shaking his head and no, I'd be wrong for you. It would probably be the opposite. Because he probably understands my faults better than I do my own. But either way, we need somebody who's objective. We need someone who's neutral. And, we all have relationships with one another in the church, but I think when we're on an equal footing with that person, where it's not a parent or a relative or someone that we just have a special relationship with, that's going to make everyone more willing to accept this advice and more willing to listen and hopefully also to be heard. Because again, going back to the idea of negotiation, a lot of times, maybe one-on-one we're a little intimidated to say what we need to say. Maybe we need someone to help us kind of understand our own thoughts and feelings about whatever the situation is. So sometimes the mediator can kind of help tease out what the real root problems, the root causes are of the issue, and help us move forward with communication, which is, again, always a huge problem. And again, going back to Matthew chapter 18, this is something that we certainly find a biblical example of. Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 15, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Again, that's the idea of reconciliation, of negotiation. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, this is obviously not exactly a mediation in a way. I mean, this is kind of talking about a charge here. But the idea, I think, is the same, that if we can't come to an agreement ourselves, then it's important for us to involve someone who understands the situation, that the evidence here is established, that we're not, just hurling accusations at one basis. At first, it's not entirely obvious, or at least it wasn't to me, what the difference was. But what is the difference in arbitration and mediation? So sometimes we hear, again, in the legal system, we hear about mediation. Then sometimes we hear about, I think about it seems like you hear about it more in like labor disputes and things like that, about arbitration. What is arbitration?
Someone usually makes that decision for you.
Okay, so it's when we're having a mediation, but we've kind of agreed in advance that whatever this person decides we need to do, we're going to do it. So mediation is a little less decided in that way. We're going to go to this person, we're going to talk, but we haven't really agreed to be bound by this decision. We've not really agreed to say, hey, whatever Joe comes up with, whatever he tells us we need to do, let's agree to just do it. Because, you and I are not going to just willingly do this on our own, but we trust him, and we know that he is going to look at, as we read earlier, he's going to look at both of our interests and help us find a way forward. And so let's agree in advance that whatever he thinks we should do, we're going to go ahead and do that. And so it is a little more severe. And again, it emphasizes, why do we need to find someone who is wise and godly and a neutral party? Because in order for us to even get this agreement that we're going to agree to be bound to this thing, we've got to find somebody that we both trust and respect enough to allow that to happen. And again, we can go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and we've talked about this a lot, this idea of lawsuits against believers. And he's talking about, why would, verse 5, it said, I say this to your shame, can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers, but brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. And so, we ought to be able, as a church, I say the church, is this limited to the members of this local church? I think there may be a lot of wisdom in finding, hey, is there a brother at another congregation that we both know and respect, but doesn't have maybe the close ties to both of us, that would maybe call into question, or maybe just cause them to be uncomfortable because now they're the one who decided this thing between us, and they're not comfortable with, well, if this all goes bad, then now the three of us are going to have beef, and we don't need that. There's a great opportunity there to say, hey, would you mind to come and meet with us, whether that be an elder at another congregation or just someone that we know will give wise counsel. Any thoughts about mediation and arbitration? I know these things, like probably most of us, are never going to have to go through this, and I hope that's the case, and I hope it's the case because we don't need to, not because we're unwilling to. But why are we talking about this? Why is it important to think about these things?
To be prepared.
Yeah.
If it gets to that level and it's not addressed in a wise way, you're talking about a church fracturing situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the whole point of this class, the whole point of studying biblical peacemaking is because we understand the importance of the church, and we understand the importance of unity within the body of Christ. And if we're not willing to think about and study about how can we promote and ensure that, then I don't think we really value it as much as we should. And so even though, these ideas seem a little extreme maybe, and they are extreme in a lot of ways, because we should hopefully never have to do most of these things to resolve a conflict. If we can resign ourselves to overlooking and reconciling all of our problems, then I think that's a great testament to the relationships that we've built with one another, and with the way that we do look after one another's interests, and we do set aside our pride and egos. But we all know that reality is there are going to be times when things are going to come up, whether it be, again, material things or just emotional situations or what have you, where there can be some real problems and there can be some real hurt feelings and there can be some things that are going to be difficult for us to move forward from. And so I think it's important for us to be armed with the understanding of these are things that the Bible talks about. And they don't always talk about them in the context that we may find ourselves in needing them, but the principles are there. And so that's why I think it's important for us to understand those things. And then the last thing there is accountability. And, accountability doesn't seem like a response when we just say that word. Accountability is more of seems like more of a concept. But I think it's very much a process, and it's one that unfortunately we see happen a lot when it comes to things like church discipline. When we see someone who is, walking wayward from the truth, and oftentimes it's someone who is just fallen away from the faith, who has become weak, who has stopped worshiping, attending, participating with the church. That's oftentimes when this accountability and, or as we might say, church discipline comes into play. But I think there's also opportunities where, if there is a conflict, and we've tried to negotiate, we've tried to mediate, we've tried to arbitrate, we've tried to do anything and everything to get this situation resolved, but perhaps there's one, perhaps there's two people who are just unwilling to get over it, unwilling to find a way forward, unwilling to set aside their pride, their ego, unwilling to submit to godly wisdom, unwilling to submit to their brethren. What should the church do? What can the church do?
The elders have to take action.
Yeah.
We have to encourage and hope for.
I think that you're absolutely right that that's where it starts is encouragement, and we need to be the kind of people who encourage one another and say, hey, this is no longer just a you problem. This is an us problem, and if we don't get a handle on it, we're very concerned about what it can lead to. And, we see the problems that can come up in the church and the way that lines can be drawn, sides can be taken, and what starts as a problem between two brethren becomes factions. And when you start having factions, then that's when things get really messy. And that's not a place that we ever want to get to. And part of how we don't get to that is accountability. When someone is refusing to do what is right, and if someone is harboring a grudge, harboring ill will, unwilling to seek reconciliation, unwilling to sit down and talk to their brother in Christ, then we are beginning to tread dangerously into the territory of sin. And the church has an obligation to act because of the unity that's at stake. Particularly if a brother is sowing discord and refuses to repent. Matthew chapter 18, verse 17, going back to that same passage that we read earlier and continuing. Refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church, and if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. And so this kind of progression of accountability that we would go through, where hopefully we can resolve it just one-on-one. That is the ideal. I've got a problem with you. We sit down. We figure it out. and we move forward. We put it aside and we become reconciled. We do whatever it is we need to do to be reconciled, whether it's simple, I'm sorry and I forgive you, or if there's some more serious work that needs to be done, but we reconcile. And if there's material things, we negotiate, we mediate, we arbitrate, we do whatever we need to do. That has to come from an attitude of desiring peace. Again, the phrase in your handouts there, peace is not what? Peace is not the absence of conflict. But it's a presence of real peace, of true unity, and the kind of unity that the harmony that comes from people who are walking in step together toward God, seeking His will, and setting aside their own passions and their own desires to do that. And so when someone is unwilling to seek that and to walk that way, then the church has a decision to make. Are we going to allow that person to throw everybody else out of step, or are we going to hold them accountable to that? And as it says here, treat them as a Gentile and a tax collector, and make them understand that their actions and attitudes are incompatible with the love of God. They're incompatible with the unity of the church. And as with any kind of church discipline, this is not a hateful action. This is not I always kind of hate that idea of shunning. There is some wisdom in some separation and some understanding of what we can and can't be a part of together. But this is an action designed in love to bring someone back, and whatever form that takes, it needs to be the kind of thing where we want you to be a part of this work, but you've got to be working with us, not against us. And so it's important for us to understand the attitude that has to go along with that in order that we can be peacemakers. Any thoughts, comments about assisted peacemaking? And I would also say that, when we talk about, all these things and all these $20 words, sometimes that makes it seem more intimidating, more formal than it needs to be. I mean, we're not going to have a tribunal here at the church building every time, somebody has a little grievance with one another. I don't think it needs to be like that. It can be more informal than that, but it's the heart of it. And it's the willingness to say, I want peace. And it's also the willingness to say, I'm not sure how to get there on my own, but thanks be to God that there are people that I know that can help me. There are people that I know can guide me to that place. And so when we kind of set aside our ego and allow that to happen, it can be a great benefit to us. I think, again, oftentimes it can be as simple as just sitting down, cup of coffee, and allowing ourselves to open up. Communication is 100% critical to all this. If we're not telling the truth, and understand what I mean by telling the truth, is telling all the truth. Right? What was the lie that Satan told Eve? He didn't lie. He just told her part of the truth. And that was the lie. And so often when we're kind of trying to save face when we're trying to maybe not admit our fault in a situation, we talk about everything we did right and everything they did wrong, and nothing that we did wrong and nothing that they did right. You know, that kind of attitude can be really damaging. So we need to open up and allow ourselves to be changed, allow ourselves to be transformed. Because oftentimes, you know, maybe we've been wronged, maybe we didn't help the situation either. We can all work together to improve. We've got a few more minutes here. We'll just look at some of the questions here. Which of the responses on this slippery slope do you think we often default to the most? Anybody want to kind of share what your default is?
I think overlooking is probably the biggest.
I think so too. Yeah. I think that's probably where most of us, and I think oftentimes that's good. You know, if our desire is to just not be so easily offended that we're constantly quarreling with one another, I think that's a great attitude. But at the same time, if we're overlooking, but we're still really hurt, and you know we're not having the kind of relationship with people that we ought to because I overlooked that, but we didn't really, then we're in denial and we're calling it overlooking. So we got to be careful about that, and we got to make sure that, you know, if there's something that, you know, someone has a problem with, that, you know, we're overlooking and overlooking and overlooking. I would almost add on this, you know, maybe appeasement is another response, and you know, appeasement can sometimes be beneficial. It's not real great with a 3-year-old, I can tell you. And you know, you do so much appeasement, and the next thing you know, you're invading Poland, and it's a real problem. Not Austin, but so we got to be careful about those things. Hopefully, whatever we default to is closer to the left side than the right side of the spectrum there.
Yeah, I would just say overlook requires forgiveness, and forgiveness is hard. And if we think we're overlooking it, but we're not exercising our forgiveness, then that's not really overlooking it.
Right.
That's denying it or shoving it away or whatever.
Yeah.
But forgiveness means I eat it.
Yeah.
That's hard.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if it does hurt, and I decide for the sake of this relationship, and it's not that important, I'm going to eat it.
Yeah.
That's different.
Yeah. And again, I think the easiest way to kind of cipher out the difference is, did it change our relationship? I mean, are we still going to go do the things that we used to do? Are we still, you know, as cordial and friendly and whatever as we used to be? Or are we just kind of avoiding each other? Are we falling from denial into flight, into staying away from that person because we're denying that we're denying the problem? You know, I think that's essentially what flight is denying that we're denying that there's an issue. So we need to be very careful about that. But certainly, if we have the heart to forgive, then we're absolutely on the right track. And what do you suppose gets in the way of folks engaging in peacemaking responses?
Pride.
Yeah. Pride, ego. Sure. But I would go back to relationships. You know, we can't be reconciled with someone if we've never been reconciled with them. if we don't have a relationship to reconcile, then we're not going to find it important enough to reconcile with them. And so often we fail to get to the point that we even have a strong enough relationship to want to reconcile. Thank you, guys.